Okay, that's right. All the seats are full, so we're going to go ahead and start. So we're here at this session to give some updates on the U.S. government's policies on providing public access to federally funded research results and some of the projects that sprang up around that. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we'll move on to our speakers. First up will be Howard Ratner, who's the Executive Director of CORE, Inc., to give us an update on CORUS, a solution for providing public access to research papers resulting from federally funded research that comes from a coalition of publishers. Mark Doyle will be next from the American Physical Society, and he is the head of CORUS's technical working group to talk about implementation of CORUS, of what that process is like. They'll be followed by Linda Plunkett, who is from Boston University Library. And she'll be talking about SHARE, which comes from the Association of Research Libraries, the Association of American Universities, and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. And SHARE is interesting because it was really initially catalyzed by this OSTP memorandum, but it's a much larger scale project to build a series of interconnected library-based repositories to serve as archives for a broad range of research materials, including but not limited to research papers. And then finally, our last speaker will be Mike Stebbins from the OSTP. I've just received a text from him that his plane has landed. He is hopping in a cab momentarily. I was going to put up a Where's Waldo kind of thing for him, but he will be here hopefully by the end of the session to talk about data and public access to data and the role that journals can help play in bringing that about. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of the sort of current state of the U.S. government policy, at least as I understand it. You're probably already familiar with the NIH's longstanding public access policy. In 2008, a law was passed that requires papers resulting from NIH funding must be deposited in PubMed Central, made available within 12 months of publication, and that hasn't changed. That law is still in effect, but the development that we're all working to come to grips with was this the White House issuing a memorandum in February of 2013. And it was a two-part memo. First, they gave each federal agency spending more than $100 million yearly on research, they gave them 6 months to put together a plan to provide public access to published articles resulting from that research. No specific route for access to papers was prescribed, no licensing terms required, and the memo specifically stated that all plans must be feasible with no additional funding. The second half of the memo is a much more ambitious sort of first step toward archiving and making public all of the research data that's generated in those studies. First, looking at the research paper objectives, I think these are a lot further along. I suspect we'll see more movement on these in the short term. The key provisions of this policy is that really the goal is to leverage existing infrastructure as much as possible. Again, no new funds are available to the agencies to achieve these goals, so public-private policies public-private partnerships are strongly encouraged. There have to be strategies for long-term stewardship of the papers, for facilitating public discovery and search tools, and for facilitating reuse of the papers, presumably for things like text and data mining. The policy calls for a default 12-month embargo for public access to papers, but each agency has to provide a mechanism for petitioning for changes in that embargo period. Final draft proposals were due last August. Those were all turned in. They were reviewed, returned for revision. Some have been returned after that. Some are still being revised. Really, from what I've heard, some agencies are closer to implementation than others. We'll be hearing things trickling out over time. The OSTP has emphasized that agencies not be locked into one particular mechanism, that policies be flexible enough to evolve over time. So what we're really likely to see is a mix of different approaches from different agencies, and as each proves its values, agencies will adapt to use the most effective methods available. Let's see. The second half of the memo is a much more ambitious first step towards archiving and making public all the data generated from federally funded research. And this one has a lot more, I think, to work out than the papers part of the memo, I mean, we have a long-established infrastructure for access to research papers. We have a publishing industry and a research community that are eager to work with funding agencies to provide access to papers. But for data, there's less infrastructure already in place. There's no clear private sector group offering support. And there's actually a great deal of opposition from within the research community about putting all their data out there until they've had a chance to fully exploit it themselves. Key provisions here are very similar to the paper's objective, but they also include protecting patient confidentiality and other privacy issues, recognizing and respecting intellectual property rights, and really finding a balance between long-term preservation of data and the cost associated with it. How long do we have to keep this stuff? How long is it useful to keep this stuff and make it available? So that part of the policy is really, in some ways, a much bigger can of worms than the more straightforward access to papers objectives. And it may take longer to implement, but personally, I think it'll probably prove more valuable in the long run. So that's kind of the current state of things. And I'm going to turn things over to Howard, who is going to talk about Chorus.